welcome colleagues to our panel. It's really exciting to have this discussion kick off. This is the first of a series of consultations that our governance team is hosting to really unpack the future of governance. What does that mean? And what's really exciting in particular is the focus on social contracts. And what is the new social contract that is needed for sustainable development? This first dialogue is going to focus on digital governance. As we know, digital is very rapidly transforming economies and societies, and COVID has only accelerated the pace of digital transformation. In the context of the COVID-19 recovery, the Secretary General has called for a new social contract between governments, people, civil society, businesses, and a social contract that must integrate employment, sustainable development, social protection, based on equal rights and opportunities for all. So one thing as we move through this discussion on digital governance and rebuilding or transforming the social contract, it's really important for us to think about this expansive definition of the social contract. So it's not just about citizen and state or citizen and government, but it's about the range of actors that have a role to play in the modern social contract. So that's an important expansion for us to think about. Coming back to the issue of digital, I think it's important to reflect on the accelerating pace that technologies are transforming economies and societies. And the reason I re-emphasize this is because what's happened is that our systems for governance around these digital technologies are old. They're old, they're fragmented, they're reactive, and we can no longer wait to update these systems. And we're falling further and further behind with regard to that. So the digital governance aspect demands that we relook at the social contract and to make sure that the application of digital technologies is indeed advancing sustainable development and leaving no one behind. So the assessment and the need for this assessment is even more necessary as the private sector and new actors, which are part of the social contract, become more and more dominant in what was traditionally public sector service delivery. The Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and Extreme Poverty has sounded the alarm on the rise of the digital welfare state and the lack of regulation of the tech sector by governments, which has led to growing inequality and what he calls the human rights free zone. So we need to really look at digital in terms of making sure that whatever governance system we have actually does not deepen inequalities, deepen risk, deepen vulnerabilities. How do we do that? At the same time, we also need to look at digital divide. We know that 3.6 billion people don't have access to broadband or internet. So that's a major inequality that we have to overcome as we're thinking through digital governance. As the moderator, I don't want to spend too much time talking. We have a very, very exciting set of panelists who are going to take us through a series of quick presentations, and then we want to open it up and have a very, very interactive discussion. Just to also situate this in the UNDP universe, the presentations and all of this will be available on the Spark Blue page that's dedicated to this consultation on the future of governance, and we're going to encourage you to keep the conversation going there. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce our colleague Tariq Malik, who is a Surge Advisor on Digital Governance, but has had significant experience at the country level on digital issues. So over to you, Tariq. And then after that, we're very, very lucky to have with us Nina Sun, who's a professor and the Deputy Director of Global Health at Drexel University. And we know that digital health is one of the big areas that we're all working on in the context of COVID. And then after that, we're going to throw it open to discussion, and we really want to have an interactive discussion. So over to you, Tariq.
Thank you very much, Mandeep, for the kind introduction. And welcome everybody. This looks great. You know, instead of sitting in the conference room, we are on the uh, computer screen, and it looks like a technology uh, theater. So, and you know, the thing about technology theater is that it is working and visible when expert debates are amplified through Zoom. Broadcast and digital platforms creates the appearance of public debate without engaging public. So my presentation today is basically about just that, that the largest and most damaging cost of technology theater is actually is the political fragility that results when institutions are built without public understanding, investment, or interest. So when we talk about building new social contract and we look at the role of digital governance, we have to see it through citizens' eyes, through the public debate, by engaging the public. So let's talk about digital governance. It's less about digital, but more about governance. It's an enabler of inclusive government, and it's multidimensional, it's cross-cutting various areas of governance. If digital governance is about development, it must be people-centric. They are the main, uh, uh, they are the main stakeholders. And as our slogan was, I think it has changed now, but if we strive for empowered lives and resilient nations, then it must enable strengthening the social contract. And in COVID-19 situation, it is testing the validity of social contract, which means that people are asking that can we count on our state? Even the victims of COVID-19 are asking, can you even process our death certificate or can you register our birth? So what we have is that on one side, we have this old uh, types of technologies, which some people call toys for the boys. You know, you have mobile phone, you have SMS technology, you have Zoom, you have biometric system, facial recognition system, iris system, fingerprinting system. But and on the other side, you have threads of governance, you know, human rights, as Mandeep was saying, policies, framework, you have strengthening the institution, you are helping the countries to support the election process and all that. All these threads are intertwined into overall strategic plan per member state. But we have always seen through the prism of government by helping member states. What we need to do is when we are rebuilding social contract or new social contract, we have to go back to the future. It's not nothing something new, but we have to go back to the core, and that is look at through the eyes of citizen for SDG 16, right? So how this all is interconnected, the digital part, the governance part, it is interconnected through what we call social contract. It is a contract is a legal document. So uh, what are the systems in digital governance which actually amplify the governance piece? There are two types of system if we see it from citizens eyes. And these are foundational system as per ID 4D, identification for development. That's a program run by World Bank. Achim is on the executive council, I and ILR on the technical working group, helping the member state to actually move towards registering everybody in the world, which is actually SDG 16.9, target 9, which says everybody should have legal ID. There are 1.1 billion people who do not have an ID, and they are not counted. And if you can't count the people can't count on the state, and the writ of the state is weakened, which is, and that vacuum is occupied by business elite, by power elite, as Mandeep has also suggested in our introductory remark. So foundational systems, so let us first look at from citizen eyes. Citizen wants her birth registered. She should be recognized by the state in form of any identity imprint. She wants to have a freedom of movement, but state wants to test her driving skill. She wants to record her marriage or divorce, get the health benefit. She wants to make her choice by casting a vote. She wants to own a property, pay taxes, and in situations like COVID-19, she wants help from the government when she needs government. And then the countries who have strong foundational system, they can quickly come up with these all these things, functional system, which are like voter register underpinning one person, one identity, one vote, the tax ID system, social security number, driver's license. And the countries who have weak foundational system for good reasons, because they want to protect the privacy of the citizen, like USA or UK, they have to find innovative ways to use functional system as foundational system. And in the time of crisis like these, they are struggling from pillar to post. Just like in US, now everybody is getting temporary basic income, and when the resources are scarce, you have to distribute them to the most needy people. And similarly, UK, they don't have strong foundational system. So the result is 2.4 million people said our livelihood was severed by pandemic crisis, by this pandemic, and 1.4 million or 1 million identities they can confirm. They don't know whether the other people who are asking for help are actually who they are. So UN e-government survey, EGDI, Electronic Government Development Index, released by UNDESA, confirms to this fact that the countries who have actually strong foundational system, just like Denmark, South Korea, Estonia, even India, Pakistan, they they could reach out to the citizen quickly, and the social contract is strong. So what does it mean for us? It means that if we want in the new social contract, if we want to derive a value which is enhancing state capacity for improved service delivery, whereby we want social contract is strengthened, we want to roll out targeted subsidies for social protection, combating corruption and financial crimes, effective disaster management. I'm reading through the list of derived value on the right side. And on the left side, you see the colorful government work that we are doing. These are those threads. I have kept the colors of the threads as same. So these areas where we are doing governance and development intervention, strengthening core government function, rule of law, election, all that. And in the middle, we have digital governance and transformation. So we want to use these tools and technologies to get on the derived value in doing what we are doing already more efficiently. So, and these are the areas where I have found the digital interventions. But let's break this middle box. What is in it for us to take that will take us to the derived value? Digital governance and transformation, as Mandeep correctly mentioned, that we have a digital divide. So first of all, we have to make sure everybody has connectivity and the infrastructure to roll out these foundational and functional systems. So, but would that stop us? I have a couple of slides to find an innovative way that even sans connectivity, you can do what you want to do in the interim till the connectivity is not available. So we don't need to hold ourselves hostage for what is not available. Then in past 2 years, we have a lot of real data available for informed policy making. You know, this real data, I'm not talking about statistical theories, probability theories, Charles theories, or predictive data, but real data. Why not use that data for informed policy making? Then we have to create digital policies where we have to help policymakers to help themselves in coming up the ethical use of, for example, artificial intelligence and other policies where digital rights are also preserved, where privacy of the citizen is also preserved. And we have to do this advocacy campaign and share the knowledge and tools between the member states and the countries. For that, UNDP Tech Center, and we are creating a portfolio. We have more than 100 tools to share with the various member states, and we have to build the digital capacity. If we do all that, we have digital public goods that would take to the derived value. I'm leaving you with some of the examples of functional system, how access to health, gender equality and inclusion, social safety nets and refugees, improved governance and financial inclusion has been transformed in last few years, and examples of India, Pakistan, Argentina, Indonesia are there for you to look at it, but I have special emphasis on two interventions. And these are two case studies where a lot of data is available on this slide. But for example, Pakistan, they have registered 122 million people, which means they have empowered them with the identity. And look at the transformation that has taken place, that 98% of citizens are registered. These are not male, female, but Pakistan became first Muslim countries to issue an ID card based on your gender. So transgenders have their own identity recognized on the card. You know, all the minorities are also registered. But since 20% or 30% of 20 to 30% country has connectivity, they can work offline with this infrastructure. They have biometric point of sales, mobile phones, and some offices or franchisee network where they can roll out those functional system. So these are on the left side, you have functional systems. On the next slide, you see Malawi. I just came out from there rolling out this program. Claire has done an excellent job, DDR, who was running the show there. And we have identified ghost worker. We have empowered the citizen with the voting right. Just the first card, when it was distributed to Vanessa Banda, who is 86-year-old, she danced, and I asked her, what is in this piece of plastic for you, this ID card? And she said, I'm 86-year-old, but this is the first time somebody has recognized my existence. I can vote, I can file the report of domestic violence, what my husband did to me. I can ask for subsidy, I can do a lot of things with that. So I had to wait 86 years for somebody or some entity or the government to recognize me. So driving home, the last point on the last slide is when you have strong foundational ID system, just like what we did in Pakistan, you can roll out functional system, you can roll out higher subsidies for relatively lower income sections, and in similar way you can roll out lower subsidies for relatively higher income sections. So this is how developing countries can create the fiscal space. On the left side, we have calculated, there is a report, People and Money, launched by Secretary General. Had we had strong foundational system, look at this, we could have incentivized 2.7 billion people in 132 developing countries to stay home for up to 6 months. And the cost to government was 12% of total financial response to COVID-19 in 2020. All of this talk is backed by the reference material, and these are hyperlinks. Some of the articles I have written in various magazines, so those are also listed, and some are the reports that I mentioned are available, which you can see, and it is time for question and answers, and I'm available for that. Thank you. And the
Great, thank you,
presentation
Tariq.
will be available, it would be shared with everybody.
That's it. It's going to be available on Spark Blue. And thanks so much for highlighting, I think, the importance of having an inclusive digital economy, the need for human and institutional capacity. I want to move on to our next speaker, Nina Sun, who I am hoping is going to spend some time talking about the protection of human rights and human agency. How do we promote digital trust, security, and stability? Because we're in a context where there is a pushback on human rights. There are forces contracting civic space. The trust between citizens and governments is diminishing. And then we've got the private sector, and we didn't talk too much in Tariq's presentation about the private sector. And I'm going to ask him to come back and talk about the private sector in his, sorry, my video's off, when we get to the question and answers. So without much further ado, over to you, Nina, and welcome.
Thank you so much. Well, first of all, thank you to Mandeep for the invitation to come and speak with you all. And it's such a pleasure to go both after Mandeep and Tariq, because Tariq's presentation gave such a great overview of, digital governance from a very broad perspective. As Mandeep mentioned, my background is mostly as a health and human rights expert. So what I'm hoping to do is take a health approach which is a very specific lens. But what's fascinating when we talk about digital technologies and governance and health is that many of the challenges and opportunities, as you'll see, are pretty much the same across the board, because we're all grappling with how we actually interact meaningfully in a way that's ethical, that respects human rights, that really advances our social justice and accountability goals. How do we do that with digital technologies? So first, what I'd like to do is, kind of go through some of the challenges. But then, as human rights people want to do, I don't want to focus too much on the negatives. I want to also then pivot to, what are some opportunities where we can really kind of take the reins as people who are interested in governance and sustainable development and social accountability, and how can we put those safeguards in place to make it a better response? So, I think the importance of the right to health in 2020 cannot be underscored. We're all experiencing an unprecedented time. And, to follow up on Mandeep's opening point, taking an expansive definition of how we look at development, not as, working in silos anymore, but as we look at how do we integrate the meaningful work that we've been doing across the different sectors is more important than ever. And we can see how the lack of ability to further the right to health is really undermining critically other rights, the right to vote, the right to work, the right to education. We can see more than ever that these are all integrated. So some of the challenges that we see when we look at COVID and the use of digital health technologies can be categorized quite broadly in 3 points. So the first is data breach, which basically means the accidental or unlawful destruction, loss, alteration, or unauthorized access to personal information. And that can be health information, obviously, when we're talking about digital health technologies, but it can also be any other type of information. So that can include bank statements, educational information, et cetera. Social security number if you're based in the US, et cetera. The second challenge that we really face is looking at bias. So what's interesting is that when people start thinking about digital technologies and data, they almost see it as neutral. There's a tendency to see, well, it's an algorithm, or it's machine learning. So machines, they're not discriminatory. They don't have bias. But the fact of the matter is that they do, because the people who build the algorithms, the people who build the machines have a certain experience. They come from a certain background, and what happens is that these stereotypes, these prejudices are often coded unintentionally or otherwise into the algorithms that we see in digital technologies. And so what we've seen in the literature and what we've seen in research is that, digital applications and digital technologies have the propensity to actually further exacerbate the biases and discriminations that currently exist in an analog society, if you will. So it's really important to be vigilant about how to address bias. And finally, the third challenge that we're really seeing is function creep. So what this means is a gradual widening of the use of technology or a system beyond what it was originally intended to do. So a specific example within the context of HIV is, let's say, you're a person living with HIV and you go and you seek either access to testing or HIV treatment. You go into a new clinic, they collect personal information, they put it into their electronic medical records, and it's more than just your HIV status, it's also looking at your personal health history and your behavior history oftentimes. So, if this information is not secure and safeguarded, and if there isn't a specific purpose delineation for what that information can be used for, then other people may have unauthorized access to that information, such as immigration authorities who are interested in what your immigration status is in a country, or law enforcement officials who may be interested in behaviors that you may engage in, which may or may not be legal within a country. And here, within the context of HIV, this is particularly concerning because, as many of you probably know, the key populations that bear the disproportionate burden of HIV globally are often the populations that are the most stigmatized, that are the most marginalized, and in many countries that are also criminalized. So these three challenges have very real and fundamental implications in people's daily lives. And the key human rights that are implicated when we talk about these challenges within the use of digital technologies really most obviously are the rights to privacy, as well as the rights to non-discrimination. But also when we think about it within the context of COVID-19 and other health considerations, we're talking about the right to health and the right to benefit from scientific progress. But now where I want to move to is talking about what can actually be done. I mean, when we talk about all of these challenges with digital technologies, it sounds quite overwhelming. But what's great and what's super interesting to follow when we talk about the use of digital technologies is that human rights law has evolved to incorporate more standards that states can adopt to meaningfully put in safeguards to mitigate some of these concerns that I just highlighted. So first, in addressing the right to privacy, several of you have probably heard of the European Union's General Data Protection Regulation, or the GDPR. But there are also a lot of other regional agreements. So there's the African Union Convention on Cybersecurity, the Asia Pacific, the APEC Privacy Framework, as well as the Ibero-American Standards for the Americas that really set out these principles, including having strict requirements for data collection and use, so data processing, and having a recognition of kind of these new rights of individuals, which we call them, in digital health, in digital tech parlance, data subjects. So new rights for data subjects. So what we're talking about here are rights such as the right to rectification, the right to erasure, the right to be forgotten, and the right to data portability. And what these rights really mean is that they are setting up a framework to ensure that people whose data are collected are able to have ownership and control of the data that they give into the system. So it's really, to the points that were made by Tariq and the point that was made by Mandeep, it's really a step to ensure that there's more trust in the system and that there's really the ability for communities and individuals to meaningfully participate and take ownership of the information that they give to governments and the private sector. And finally, these regional agreements also set high standards for security and confidentiality, at least at the broad level. In addition, when we talk about safeguarding the right to non-discrimination, it's really important to think from a legal perspective how current non-discrimination laws may be applied to instances where there's the use of digital technologies. So most recently, many of you are probably aware of a court case in Kenya regarding the biometric system, where the High Court of Kenya basically said, we understand that the Kenyan government would like to put into place a biometric system, a national ID system, and that is a legitimate purpose, but before that can proceed, safeguards must be in place to protect adequately citizens' personal information and personal data. And moreover, the use of biometrics in this particular instance is complicated because of the other challenges that I highlighted earlier in my discussion about function creep or about bias. So it's really important to have those safeguards in place before proceeding with the digitalization of those identity systems. And that was built on this idea of the right to privacy as well as a right to non-discrimination as well. And then finally, when we talk about the digital divide, there's always a question of how we look at the digital divide and how we address it. And, there seems to be a tendency to get very excited about digital technology because it's new and it's innovative. And, I think people are just tired of seeing systems not function, the analog systems. But oftentimes we forget to ask ourselves a threshold question of where exactly are the gaps in the current systems that exist? And importantly, how can digital technology be used as a tool to actually address these systems? Not as the only solution, but as a tool. Because as we see, and as we've seen play out many times in countries, if digital technology is built on top of an already flawed system that perpetuates biases, that perpetuates human rights violations, the addition of digital technologies will only accelerate and exacerbate the situation. It will not necessarily resolve them. And one of the reports that was brought up in the opening, Philip Alston, the Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty's report on the digital welfare state, was critical in delineating the fact that although it's important to have digital technologies, we have to take advantage of the opportunities that they present. It's also fundamentally as important to have analog systems that both work for both the purposes of building on effective digital technologies, but also acknowledging the fact that not everyone will have access to digital technologies. So it is critically important to make sure the analog systems that are in place also function well. And I know I'm very short on time. There's so many other things to cover, but 3 quick last points that I just want to say. First is the importance of regulation. So regulating digital technologies is an incredibly complex topic that probably necessitates its own session. But within the context of health, there are health technology assessments. And so there's been some discussion of how do we use the systems that are already in place to start assessing the effectiveness of digital technologies, and also importantly, how they protect human rights and how they're ethically designed, and whether there's participatory development with the communities and users that are meant to use them. And then finally, there's ethical principles. And oftentimes when we talk about the private sector, it's a very complicated situation because traditionally the private sector and human rights, they're not the traditional audience. It's mostly been member states. However, there's a lot of discussion on how ethics should be integrated into the private sector. So here we're talking about beneficence, we're talking about transparency, and for digital technologies, it's also algorithmic transparency. All of these key principles that we've learned from other sectors, including the biomedical ethics, all of these are important and can be translated into the private sector. In addition, human rights law has evolved to actually apply to the private sector as well in some instances. So here we're talking about what's called human rights due diligence, and that comes from the UN Principles on Business and Human Rights. So do private sector companies and big tech companies, do they have human rights policies systemically integrated into the culture of the organization? And do they have systems, policies, and functions in place to actually ensure that whatever products are developed, how they're adopted, how they're used, how they're monitored and evaluated? Is there a constant feedback loop of checking on whether they're also aligned with ethics and human rights? And the last point I will make, and then I'm very keen to hear the discussion, is about the concept of really building trust. I mean, we know this from the HIV epidemic. The motto there from communities is nothing about us without us. And oftentimes when we look at digital technologies, they're seen as kind of this, only experts can deal with this, only experts can develop this, can adopt this, can implement this. But the fact of the matter is that co-participatory design within digital technologies is fundamental. And the tech sector has started doing this, and we should be learning from the previous sectors before us, like HIV, and saying, okay, if we think a digital technology can help in this instance, are there opportunities to design with users together the technology in a way that best supports their needs? Are there opportunities to evaluate how this is going later on down the line, and developing this feedback loop, not only to maintain effective technologies, but ensure meaningful participation, and also create trust so that the technologies will be used in the best way possible that respects and protects human rights. So thank you so much, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Nina. And I think between you and Tariq, you've done a wonderful job of, traversing the systems, the policies, the regulations, some of the key principal issues that are required to deploy these technologies in such a way that they actually address inequalities and redress inequalities as opposed to deepening them. And I think this point about what's coming through very clearly is the immense potential of digital to increase access to services, to increase civic space, to really progress rights to education, right to health, right to access all sorts of other services, but it needs to be done properly with the right regulations, with the right human rights and ethical principles. And I was pleased that you brought up this whole notion of the participation of individuals and communities who are most affected, and the role of the private sector. As we know, increasingly governments across the world are ceding responsibilities around health, education, and to the private sector. So how does the private sector fit into the social contract in the whole digital space? So we had a couple of questions in the chat. We've had one or two questions on what's country examples, what's happening around digital, the great work in Bangladesh. Hao Liang's asking Tariq to say a little bit more about that. We also saw a great example from Palestine being described in the chat, and then some questions about data security, misuse of data, and how do we deal with that? And then I also have a question about the progress on domesticating the regional agreements you talked about, Nina. How is that? What is your experience of how that's going? Because we see in many spheres that there are many regional agreements or global agreements, but then when it comes down to translating them at the country level into domestic legislation or regulation, and then building capacity to use them, that there's often a gap there. So Tariq, let me start with you, and then I'm going to open the floor to colleagues who may want to come in and speak a little bit as well. So Tariq, over to you first on Bangladesh and any other sort of country examples. Yeah, please.
Thank you very much, Nina. I will address two important threads that you have mentioned. One is Bangladesh is a success story using digital transformation, how they have leapfrogged towards transforming the service delivery. And the second one is, which Nina has also articulated, the privacy issue, the data security issue. And what are the strategies? Some of them she has mentioned and some I will elaborate more. So these two important threads are emerging from various questions. We can look at the country's specific intervention, but in another deeper dive, but let me suggest that in Bangladesh, citizens need not travel more than 4 kilometers to access more than 150 essential services through 5,865 digital centers. So that is the nutshell of digital transformation that has taken place in Bangladesh. I have shared in the chat box the link to the organization A2I, Access to Information. And there is a presentation in last dialogue where Mr. Chowdhury has explained how Bangladesh has capitalized optimal use of digital intervention by reaching out to the public and strengthening the social contract. So that is one. Now let's talk about the risks and what Nina mentioned and the questions that I'm getting on the privacy. So the privacy and security is an important concept. The interventions that we are making in different countries, we are ensuring that there was a term coined by Dr. Anne, I forgot her last name, it's called PBD, privacy by design. So it is all the more important than when you set up these functional and foundational system, privacy by design in the architecture of that system is ensured. It is privacy by design means privacy in terms of being proactive, not reactive, preventive, not remedial, and it's privacy by default. It's end-to-end security and it's life cycle protection. Life cycle means enrolling the people, then getting their identity verified, authentication, credential checking, till the generation of the record, and then keeping that record sacred. How we can ensure that the citizen data is not compromised? There are 4 types of controls that I have applied in actually now 6 or 7 countries very effectively, especially in Africa and South Asian countries. One is the legal control, and Mandeep, we were talking a couple of days ago about that also, that legal framework should be robust, that it protects the citizens' rights. Then there are management controls, means monitoring, oversight of the data. And then operational controls means the people who are in charge of keeping that data safe and secure, they are aware of security protocol and privacy issues, and they are up to mark with the trainings. And then there are technology controls. I won't go into the detail of technology controls because that discussion would become boring, because it is all about ISO, IEC 29100 privacy standards. So we need to ensure that these ISO standards are there. But look at what India Aadhaar is doing, look at what Pakistan is doing, look at other countries, even developed countries, Estonia is doing, Bangladesh is doing. They have various ways to ensure that the citizen data is not compromised. They are using tokenization. For example, my ID card, my social security number is not released, but a token is generated for the services. They anonymize the data also, that last 4 digits of social security number are enough. And then they mask the data also. So there are various ways to deal with it. But the point I want to make in this group is that let's come to think about if our data is safe with the private companies or the government. Yeah, government can misuse Big Brother, that's fine, that's not fine, but we have to ensure that they don't use that, but they are accountable. A constituent of any city, can hold the neck of his elected representative in the parliament, that, you know, or in the National Assembly, saying what you are doing with my data, or that chief director of agency. But what's happening in the private sector, and you can put that executive director in jail. I have put 62 people in NADRA, National Database and Registration Authority, in jail for violating the identity theft. But how many people are in jail in private sector? I mean, last 7 top breaches. If you have Yahoo account, if you have visited Marriott, if you have LinkedIn account, if you have your credit data is with Equifax, if you have purchased something on eBay, and if you are using Adobe Acrobat, the chances are that your data is in these companies' hand, and who knows on whose hand, because, you know, these are the top breaches. So nobody is in jail. So we have to work on the public policy issue, making the business, as Mandeep, you mentioned, responsible. And there is a realization. That's why we have these roundtable, business roundtable, where 100 CEOs are interacting together, making sure that citizens' rights are not compromised. But this is not, the privacy and security should not prevent us, you know, making sure that 1.1 billion people in the world do not have an ID. Most of them are in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, poorest and most vulnerable groups, including marginalized women and girls, less educated people, persons with disability, people living in rural and remote areas, stateless, refugees, asylum seekers. 1 in 2 women in low-income countries don't have an ID, and they are not counted. They are invisible as far as digital dividend of development is concerned.
Okay, great. Thank you, Tariq. I'm going to just hand over to Nina, and then I'm going to ask everybody to be very brief in their intervention so that we can be a little more democratic in sharing the space. Yeah. Nina, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Mandeep. I actually wanted to pick up off of Tariq's point on accountability, and because that also addresses the question that was raised earlier of how, you know, how much do countries actually meaningfully implement these regional agreements that I referred to in my points that I made earlier. So it's a great question, and like human rights law, you know, it kind of depends. So, I mean, the GDPR is a legally binding treaty, whereas as well as the AU Convention, but the standards in the privacy framework, they're more soft law. It's more like political commitments agreements. And you know, these are kind of technical legal details, but the important thing is the standards have been set. And the real question is, how do we use those standards as well as what currently exists to create an ecosystem to safeguard and protect human rights, and to, precisely to Tariq's point, to look at accountability. You know, a lot of the times, you know, when there's been the adoption of digital technologies, it's well intended. It's meant to redress a gap, but, you know, it either doesn't play out or isn't implemented well, or there are genuine human rights concerns that just weren't thought of in advance. So the real question is, how do we take the opportunities and look at what currently exists, and also see what's needed from a legal, regulatory, and ethical perspective to address this? So concretely within the realm of health, because that's what I know best, you know, when we look at some countries, again, I brought up the role of health, technical health assessments, right? So looking at what role can they play in looking at the effectiveness of different health technologies, but also how different technologies protect or, you know, respect and further ethical obligations. And then also when we talk about in the realm of health, there's also national digital health strategies that are being furthered at the country level, which are really meant to coordinate and be strategic about how digital technologies are used for a certain function. that type of collaboration between government entities, as well as, necessarily also includes thinking about how to work with the private sector, provides a real opportunity to coordinate policies and laws and, opportunities to say, okay, if this is a problem, then the review mechanism is this institution, or the obligations that are violated here fall under X, Y, and Z laws. So that's another opportunity to create a way to talk about accountability, to talk about safeguarding human rights.
Thanks so much. And I want to just highlight a couple of the questions that we've had in the chat. One specifically about private sector engagement in digital, and what does that look like, and do we have examples of that? There was also another very interesting question about empowering women in participatory design around digital technologies and digital tools. And I want to highlight something that's kind of a little bit implicit to what both you and Tariq have talked about, which is the individual and the individual's perception of who owns their data, and how that perception, I think, is different across generations. Because when I think about young people who are very happily giving away all sorts of information on Facebook and apps, and really when you talk to them about privacy, they have a very different conception than someone in my generation, let's say. And so I think there's some interesting things about the notion of privacy. And just bringing it back to UNDP, I think UNDP plays a very important role in developing practical guidance, whether it's on human rights, whether it's on knowing your rights, certainly all things that we've done in the HIV and health space, as well as practical guidelines for government in sort of deploying technologies through health technology assessments, through checklists that are being developed for governments as easy tools as they're deploying digital services. So let's throw it open. I'm going to ask Ezgi to help me. We had one question on interoperability and examples on that from Cabo. We had an example from Cabo Verde, but if there's other examples. But before we come back to Nina and Tariq, I want to see if there are colleagues who are listening in. We have over 170 people online, which is fantastic. And I'm wondering if, and there's been some very rich inputs on the chat, but is there anybody who'd like to take the floor and share an experience from a country perspective, or share a technical perspective, or ask a question, or agree or disagree, or raise something that we haven't thought about yet? So please, Ezgi, can you bring in any colleagues from the floor?
Yes, sure.
Or from the room, I should say. Sorry. In the digital.
Sure, Mandeep. Perhaps we could have David Harutian to reflect a bit more on the predictive policing system, to make linkages between security sector and the data protection, if you would like to come in. Otherwise, I don't see particular hands up, but we have a lot of comments exchanged on the chat box. We have Jairo from Latin American Caribbean, who could possibly reflect a bit more.
Okay, wonderful.
Jairo,
and then I know we have
and
we also have a colleague from India on the floor, and it would be great if he could talk a little bit about the judgment of the Supreme Court from on the Aadhaar card, which I think had some interesting perspectives as well. So I'm going to put Manish on the spot and ask him to say a few things. So let's start with David and then go to Jairo, and then we'll go to Manish.
Yeah, thank you, dear colleagues, for very interesting presentations. The topic is very actual, I think, because fourth industrial revolution is moving very fast, but the governance rules, the formulas, not evolving so fast. So the topic, as I mentioned, is very important. So with regard to predictive policing, recently read the article that the predictive policing system in US, the overall is going to fail. And the city Santa Cruz, the council city of Santa Cruz banned the system of predictive policing. What is it? It uses, this is the algorithm which uses historical data on the places where crimes is concentrated for predicting future crimes. But the system does not take into consideration the moral hazard of police officers' behavior, because when the system shows on particular area that potential crime can occur, police officers sometimes behave aggressively toward the people living there. And mainly these areas are populated with Latin American people or the Black people. So the system creates really big noise in US, and many cities, not only the Santa Cruz, they started to ban the system. This is so-called the dark side of big data analytics, which shows that data needs to be inserted correctly, use the correct data, and also to take into consideration the behavioral aspects of the service that the state proposed to citizens. This is the first topic. And the second, as I also mentioned, many countries, especially the UK, Singapore, Japan, they use so-called regulatory sandboxes. This is the regulatory framework which uses safe environment where some legal aspects are not working for the time being, and they do experiment while trying to bring new digital solutions, being or the financial, some sort of tools for citizens, or for example, using the unmanned car in one city, which Japan introduced. So this is the one way how to use the digital technologies, and also to think about the data privacy, because recently in UK, there was an experiment in health sector, which also raised a big noise, because the data were used how to say, without consent of people, the data related to their health, and this is the privacy. So in this case, a regulatory sandbox maybe can be served as a panacea, how to experiment new digital solutions, and to also to think about the data privacy. Thank you, over.
Thank you so much, David. And I'm going to try and introduce a little bit of gender parity into our respondents from the floor. So let me go next to Katie, and then I'm going to come to Jairo after that. So Katie, are you there? Katie Thompson?
Yeah, I'm here, Mandy.
Wonderful.
Hi, how are you all? It's good to see you. Hello, everybody. I'm the head of the Rule of Law, Security and Human Rights team, so it's good to see you all. It's good to hear this. I'm sorry I wasn't online at the beginning, so I didn't catch everything. So I want to just try and make some kind of observations that may be useful within the context of thinking about the connection of digitalization, human rights, and the social contract in particular, and to think a little bit more deeply about how we can work on this, based in particular on some of those things that I believe it was Nina was helpfully outlining, about how any systems that we create in society reflect the inequalities and reflect the political priorities of those in power in that society. So the inequalities that are in the box come out regardless of whatever product a government is interested in supporting. So necessarily in that, if you have a highly inequitous or despotic or undemocratic government, then its systems are going to reflect that, sandbox or no sandbox. And sometimes the sandbox can help. And I think that this is a particularly pertinent and strong point for us in interrogating the connection between digitalization and social contract, as Nina has pointed out. It is not without some complexity for UNDP as a development actor, because our principal partners are government. We also do work directly with the private sector, but we will not necessarily be transposing, because of the way we are structured, all the principles from governance into, or human rights necessarily, into all the other work that we can do. So we're going to have some dissonance and some inconsistency in how we do this. And we need to think about that and think about how we put some, let's say, backbone, some human rights normative backbone into that work to address those inequities and to address also potential abuses in the system. And I think that Nina's presentation really carefully outlined the risks there, and also highlighted some of the good practices that exist and actually which are embedded in some of UNDP's work, such as the guiding principles on business and human rights. But I think it's really a critical question for us to get to the crux of, if we want to make a case that there is a positive momentum in the connection between technologies, between government ownership and control, empowerment of the people, and a renewed or reimagined positive social contract for people at country level. We need to think very hard about doing no harm, and we need to think very hard about some of those aspects Mandeep just put on the table, in particular around youth and youth engagement, and actually different ideas about privacy and what works and doesn't work. I don't think we've done enough of that, and we need to go a bit further. So in thinking about the rule of law complexity of how we work in this area, having the sandboxes is one step, obviously. It's a side step where you don't have the full regulatory regime in hand. But what goes along with laws always is systems of enforcement. And systems of enforcement are not only institutional, like the institutions need to be capacitated, they need to be professional, they need to be independent, they need to be funded, but they also need to be politically supported in a system. And what does that look like? It looks like an effective judiciary, it looks like effective independent oversight, effective media oversight, effective parliamentary oversight, and a continuous accompaniment of massive changes in technology and data management over years. So for UNDP, thinking about this in terms of these bigger systems and the inequities in the systems we work, it strikes me that all of our other work, our ongoing work on governance and our ongoing work on pursuing and supporting institutions that do attempt to bring redress and oversight for ordinary people and put ordinary people at the center of that conversation, continue to be critically important. We need to support them to work in this sector. And to bring all of these concrete issues to mind. I don't think we're quite far enough in that respect. And I think that a lot of what we're doing is we're playing with pieces where we're enabling governments to do this work, and we're supporting the private sector to make the steps forward. What we really also need to focus on is that macro picture, that we're ensuring that the broader system is in place to enable that to happen. So I'm throwing it out there just to promote the conversation. It is not, I mean, there's a lot of many corporate points I can also make about all the work in this sphere and all the amazing work that's been done at country level, particularly to get services to people during this time. That's been critical. What I'd like to do is to think about that bigger question of how you get the system to balance out these radical changes technology level. Currently, I see those systems just being emaciated and set aside. And for me, that's of quite serious concern. Thanks, Mandeep.
Thanks so much, Katie. And I think it's come up in many different ways, some of these points that you've made in our discussion. So let me go to Jairo next.
Thank you very much, Mandeep, for this opportunity and for opening the microphone. I am the team leader for governance at the regional hub in Latin America and the Caribbean here in Panama. And Tariq, first of all, congratulations. We spoke a few weeks ago. It's great to see, that you managed to pull these together. Well done on that respect. Mandeep, I was just making sharing the most recent experience that we have from digitalization in Latin America from the regional hub, and that is Honduras. With our regional project, SIGOP Systems Online, precisely yesterday, we launched the digitalization of 3 processes in the government. Regarding to the registry of brands, regarding property rights, the apostille systems, and the registration for credits, solidarity credits from the presidential office. What I wanted to highlight from this, and I think that you have mentioned this, that digitalization is the visible aspect, is the front end of the process. What goes behind it is, and what we have learned from this experience in Honduras is, that you need to work with the systems that produces that service in an integrated approach. What you see, mostly when you talk about digitalization, you are only thinking about the, the tail end, the visible aspects, but for it to be successful, it has to be based on a rigorous process. that you have highlighted, and that's the difficult part. Now, I'm stressing this because I want to make this other point, Mandeep, that was something that we have learned in Latin America during these pandemic times in the past 6 months. Government services were suspended that do not needed to be suspended, right? It's not because we didn't have the tools, but perhaps we didn't have the capacities to make those services available. Now we have this digitalization. A problem that we have in Latin America is about the lack of trust of citizens from the government. And during the pandemic, we are starting to learn that we see a large divide from citizens and public institutions, right? That during the pandemic, basically they just closed down their doors, right? And citizens could not interact, with them. And that could have easily avoided through capacities for digitalization of certain processes. Justice systems, for instance. Justice was suspended in most of Latin American cases, in the Caribbean. In 2 years ago, in Dominica, Hurricane Maria destroyed the justice archives that were in the Judiciary House. Now, that can fix through the digitalization of the justice processes, right? How do you store that information? How do you keep that information? During the pandemic, what we saw is that we had already identified that the case backlog to access to justice was one of the major bottlenecks to improve access to justice. Now, these economies are reopening, and they are reopening, and what are citizens facing? That their cases are being delayed, and now we have new cases that were not pushed during the pandemic. For these things to happen, it requires inclusion, and the message is that inclusion needs capacities.
Thanks very much, Ira. That's really well put. And I think the human and institutional capacity is a critical recommendation in the Secretary General's report on digital cooperation. And I think you've made that point very eloquently in terms of the importance of that. And I think that's an area, again, where UNDP can play an important role. Let me go now to Nader, who's been very active on the chat. Nader, over to you.
Hi, how are you? And thank you for this opportunity. It has been a very interesting conversation. I've been enjoying every single moment of it. Here in Palestine, we are kicking off our digital maturity assessment with the e-Governance Academy of Estonia. It's the first of its type that's being done in the region. What we're doing is we're working with our regional team in Arbas and Amman to conduct an assessment of all our digital services that are available between government and citizens and government and government and government and businesses. So that we will be able to come up with a comprehensive type of set of recommendations that would allow us to feed a digital solution in relationship to these different areas. So we have started this assessment, and it's going pretty well, and we hope that within the next month and a half, 2 months, the recommendations would be finalized. We're doing this also in line with the sector strategies related to each of the different ministries that are public institutions that are working here in Palestine. In the meantime, we during the COVID-19 outbreak, one of the things that came up was we were wondering what was going on with the births and the deaths, how they were recording them at the current moment when people were not able to move. So we contacted the Ministry of Interior, and they told us at the present moment we're not able to record. So immediately we went into and we met with their IT team, and immediately their IT team went to work with the Ministry of Health, and we were able to pilot a new online portal that allowed them to register the births of newborns at the hospitals. and also the deaths. And this has been something, I mean, that should have been done ages ago, but has now been introduced and is creating a new balance in terms of the terrific amounts of data that they didn't have in the past that they now have available to them real time, which will also allow them to do a lot of an analysis that would assist them in their policy making. On the death side, it solved a huge problem in the sense that they were able to significantly reduce, identity theft and fraud. Because with the Ministry of Interior being tied to the Land Authority and being also tied to the banking system, people, after somebody would pass away in the past, I mean, the Ministry of Interior was dependent upon people to coming to them to be able to record. Now they have the immediate information, so that it made it much more difficult for people to come and utilize identity theft and also other means in order to record lands that were not theirs. So I mean, there are a lot of positive things related to the digital divide, but also at the same time, many times, the old-fashioned way works even better. So there's a lot of work that needs to go into this. And so we're very happy, and we're happy to share with you over time our progress. Thank you.
Wonderful, thanks so much. And I just wanted to acknowledge a comment on the chat from Maria about the experience in Honduras and how quickly that's come up, and even in the time of COVID. And maybe it's a great example of COVID as an accelerant around digital services. And so just congratulations to Maria and the experience in Honduras. Okay, let me move quickly to Manish and Zafar, and I think we literally have 8 minutes, so I'm going to ask you to be very brief. And Manish, a little bit about the experience in India, and then some of the key points, I think, from the Aadhaar judgment, especially the minority dissent opinion, which I think are relevant to some of the discussion we're having here, and then we'll go to Zafar. Over to you, Manish.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Tariq and Nina, for a great presentation as well. I think in India, the Aadhaar is what is called as UID, Unique Identity Number. It was a scheme that the government rolled out a few years ago, that every citizen should have a unique identity number, which is an identity proof, but it also enables them to access services. The question then became that, could you be denied services if you did not have an Aadhaar card, or you did not want to show your Aadhaar card? Because it was a digital platform. The government made it mandatory at one time that you need to have an Aadhaar card. And basically, when, of course, it went to the Supreme Court. And now what the situation is, after there was a landmark judgment by the Supreme Court. What they did was, and I'm not going into the whole detail, Aadhaar is actually born out of an act of parliament. So it's not just a scheme that the government started. There's an Aadhaar Act in India. It is under an act of parliament. So it has its own rules, bylaws, and everything, and clauses. There are two important clauses that Supreme Court talked about, and they now guide the work, and it is impacting us, and I'll talk about how it is impacting the EVEN program that we run in India. So the Supreme Court said there are two kinds of services, and there is a section 4 and a section 7. So under section 7, what the Supreme Court said is, all those people who are accessing services that comes from the Consolidated Fund of India, meaning it is from the Government of India's money, Aadhaar is mandatory. If you're accessing a public service which is coming from the government's funding, then the government has all the rights to ask Aadhaar details from you. The other one was a section 4 of the Act, and there the Supreme Court said that if you are accessing services which are not funded by the government's consolidated fund, then Aadhaar is optional. Then the user can opt out. The other thing about Aadhaar is that when an Aadhaar number is entered, it's a database, the system does not show the fields that enter Aadhaar, they convert it into a 72 number code. So the actual Aadhaar number is not seen. So if later on the government departments want to, integrate different types of Aadhaar schemes, Aadhaar-related schemes, they will have to match those 72-digit codes. So the Aadhaar as such is protected. Now, how is it impacting the even work? So, as you know, the COVID vaccine is now coming up, and we had rolled out this even system, the electronic vaccine intelligence system for tracking vaccines, and it is pretty much rolled out in the whole country now. It is able to track the vaccines, but the government called us and said, we want to also track the beneficiaries who will get the COVID vaccine. The government is planning to roll out the COVID vaccine, and they may give it, it's not final yet, but they may give it to the people below poverty line, which constitute around 450 million. So they asked us to create a database module, and we are doing that, that can actually take 450 million entries. And one of the questions was that, how will you identify? So the Aadhaar became the thing, and the module that we're developing is based on Aadhaar. And the discussion went up to the highest levels. It even went up to the Secretary IT, Secretary Health, and we agreed that this vaccine, because it is being given under the funds of the government of India, so the beneficiaries should necessarily give their Aadhaar. But there was a backup plan that what if someone still doesn't want to give? Because can you deny someone a vaccine, even if it is a free vaccine, and he or she don't want to give their Aadhaar? So we are using the mobile phone as a backup plan. So Aadhaar has its implications. India does not have a data privacy law. So there are a lot of areas where Aadhaar is still optional. It is not mandatory to be used. So we will see how it goes. I mean, the COVID vaccine will be and I'm sure this could come up as an issue in other countries, wherein if the governments decide to subsidize or pre-finance or fund the COVID vaccine in the public health sector and want to track the beneficiaries, the issue of this unique identity number and data privacy will come in. I'll stop here. There's a lot more to talk about. We are actually in India also using this Aadhaar system to create a digital platform for the tribal ministry. The tribal people who live in forests don't have access to their home and the land rights. So we are creating a digital system wherein their forest right acts, the land ownership, they can digitize it at the last mile, and their rights are given or denied based on a digital system. So the idea is you can actually use a digital platform with good governance mechanisms to provide citizens centric services with Aadhaar kind of numbers required. Every country might have a different option, but in India we are very clear, Section 7 or Section 4, depending on whether the government is funding it or not.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Manish. I'm going to go to Zafar and then to Marina and then Sarah, and then we'll go to the next stage. But I'm really going to ask people to be very brief. Literally, sorry about that, 3 minutes, and then we're going to go to, because we have to close out in about 10 minutes. So please, over to you, Zafar.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mandeep, for organizing such an important discussion. And thank you very much for bringing experts, Nina and Tariq, for this discussion. This is such an important topic, and this is way forward, and there is nothing escape from this. Because I'm working in the justice sector, and my background is from justice sector, so I would like to add on what Katie Thompson has also raised some of the issues. And I would, of course, the basic thing we need, in fact, dialogue around several kind of social contexts. Like I was just going through the Tariq, that slide, the very first, he said the core functions of the government. So this nation state we conceived in 17th century from Westphalia system, but now we are living in a different world. The people, the youth, they are more educated, and now they are more aware, they want more services from the government, but the government institutions are lacking behind. So I would be interested how this system, digital system, we can, keeping in view, of course, human rights issues, keeping in view
confidentiality, privacy issue, how we can use this system to make, to bring back people trust and confidence into the institution. Today I was going through Rosemary, that's one of the statements, that's the public institutions. People don't have trust in public institutions. How we can use this system to make this public institution representative. That is the big issue. I have experienced more than 20 countries. So the public institutions are not representative. All countries, they start from policy making, they start from legislation, but legislation and policy are dominated by the business, powerful peoples. The vulnerable people we are talking about, like half of the population is not there. I don't see anywhere women, they are not presented in policy making, they are not presented in legislative drafting. That's the core thing where everything starts. So this is I think we need to organize the dialogue around these things, how we can use this technology that is with us, and this will stay with us, and it has a lot of benefit despite some people raise fear, but I'm very, very confident that we can use this for sustainable development goals, and we need to think about to make these institutions representative. So they are, and the other thing that's very important, we need to focus on, we need new products and services, justice products and services. The current systems are not working. The current systems are not accessible to the people. So that's, I think I would stop here. I don't want to take long of time, and thank you very much once again. I have been waiting for this kind of discussion for the last 2 years. So hopefully we will continue on this one. Thank you very much for it.
Thanks so much, Zafar. And I think a very interesting perspective from the justice sector, which Katie also highlighted. So Marina, over to you. Literally 2 minutes, and then we're gonna wrap up. So please, over to you. Marina, are you still there?
Do you mean me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I might have missed some part. Do you want me to reflect on what I have written in the chat box?
Yeah, I think that's if you could quickly make that intervention, that would be great. And if you want to turn on your video, that would be wonderful as well.
I would love to, but if you allow me not to do so, that
okay,
would be great.
All right, okay.
I'm in a surrounding with kids with not very optional for the video. So okay. Thanks, Mandeep, for this opportunity, and thank you for great presentations. Really, this is very interesting topic, and I think much more time really needed to go deep into all of these questions raised. So my point was rather about the tools and mechanisms that we as average users of all these digital, space have to accept as the protection of our personal data. And very often this is so complicated that you just prefer, or you just skip them because you don't have time, you don't have really the brains to understand what is required from you. So, and as an example, I talked about a request that we got recently from the governmental agency. The labor inspection unit wants to set up anonymous platform for reporting on labor right violations by the employees. But when you go deep into the technical requirements for the person who can come on this app and actually try to make his or her reporting anonymous, it's so complicated. You really have to be savvy to understand what's required from you. So you would rather prefer either go open or just to skip this and not report at all. So my point was that I think we should really think about making this more simplistic and actually put the requirements, as Tarek mentioned about the private sector, how accountable they are, and not only about the accountability, but also how much they can make this really simplistic for their end users so that people really feel this protection. Otherwise, you really feel like everything about yourself is open and you don't have any control of that. So this was basically my point. And if we can think about this at UNDP, that would be really great as we move ahead with this digitalization strategy. Thank you, over.
Thanks so much, Marina. And I think that's a really important point about, how do we part of building capacity is really making the information accessible and understandable on a range of these issues. Okay, it is, Sarah was going to come in, but she has very kindly offered to make her intervention on the Spark Blue discussion. And thanks so much, Sarah. It's now my great pleasure to introduce Robert Opp, UNDP's Chief Digital Officer, who has been listening attentively to the dialogue and the conversation, and who is going to leave us with some concluding reflections. So over to you, Rob. Welcome.
Thanks, Mandeep, and thanks to Sarah and the whole team that has organized this really important conversation. I'm not going to get into any of the details. We don't have time for that, and it would be a little bit repetitive. But I do have a couple reflections that I'm kind of walking away with. I actually joined this meeting a little bit late, and one of the reasons was that I was talking to the group of RCs. There was a conversation this morning with the regular call with all the resident coordinators led by Robert Piper, talking about digital transformation. One of the interesting themes and questions that came up in that conversation was around what is the UN's comparative advantage in digital transformation? And I actually think we need to be asking ourselves the same thing. What is UNDP's comparative advantage when we approach these issues? And you know, I think the digital space has been challenging because if you think about it, it's evolved so fast. And the natural approach to start really has been around, you know, how can we build an app, or how can we build a data system that can just be plugged into something because the government is asking us for some sort of service. And that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that work, but the problem is that it's quite fragmented when you step back and look at it, because in a number of cases, our government partners are fragmented themselves. So we get approached by one ministry or another ministry to do different kind of isolated things. And then we end up with kind of a patchwork that doesn't necessarily kind of fit into a broader framework. And so part of that is natural. I think it's a normal kind of evolution. But what I think this conversation is really highlighting is the deeper issues that all of these kinds of activities, the requests for digital support, the impact of digital on our government partners in the context and the citizenry of the countries in which we work, how does it all kind of start to fit together? So I think Tarek gave, you know, kind of a great overview of the foundational and functional. We have to be really careful, I think, not to get distracted into specific functional kind of rabbit holes, but rather be able to kind of step back and see a more of a whole. And what I'm kind of thinking coming out of this, and it's already sort of something that we've been talking about for a while, is that I think an important part of UNDP's digital transformation and our maturing as an organization that is able to embrace digital fully is that we need to develop points of view on a number of these issues that really become our way of interacting with our partners and adding value beyond the kind of specific projects. So in other words, when it comes to the issues that have been discussed here around privacy, around systems bias, around how do we deal with certain situations where rights are being compromised, or we're concerned that rights are being compromised, how do we advise governments? I think we need to prioritize these things and start to build our corporate point of view around them and be able to offer that to governments, other partners in a very holistic way, that when they come to us with, it might be a specific request, that we have a broader view that we can draw on, and that we're able to say, yes, this would make sense, but have you considered this foundational layer? Or have you considered this actual aspect of the policy and regulatory environment that you're trying to build?
Absolutely.
So,
yeah.
So I think that's where I would leave it, Mandeep. I mean, this is a really exciting moment, I think, in our digital transformation. I think, as you all know, we have a digital transformation strategy. This is a priority for the organization. So these kinds of conversations are critical. We're going to need more conversations with people like Nina and others that can inform us, more conversations among ourselves about what's working, what's not working in-house, and start to connect those dots. So with that, I just leave it there and really just grateful to be be able to be part of this.
Great. Thank you so much, Rob. And I think summing up in this way really about what is our comparative advantage and what do we offer as a trusted development partner, a forward-looking development organization to partners in country. And I'm deliberately not saying government, because I think coming back to the social contract, our interaction is very much with with all the actors involved in the social contract. So this integrated approach of looking at systems, looking at functions, but also looking at the policy, regulatory aspects, and looking very much at the principles of the United Nations Charter, human rights principles, I think are really, really critical in terms of what UNDP's value added is. And I think that's a very elegant summary and resonates strongly with a lot of what has been said. So with that, I just want to thank everybody. I'm doing this on the last day of my holiday. So, and it's just because I'm so excited about these topics that I wanted to be part of this conversation. I've learned so much about all the exciting stuff that's happening in countries, and we hope that will be great food for thought, and that it will encourage you to engage on Spark Blue. There's a dedicated page there on building new social contracts and exploring the future of governance in UNDP. And we hope that this first dialogue on digital governance will continue on the Spark Blue page and continue to inform some of the other dialogues which will run between now and the end of the year. And thank you to Sarah and David and Ezgi and everybody for inviting me to join, and to all of you for sharing your immense experience and knowledge on the issue. Thanks very much, everybody. Have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.